Hello, everyone, and welcome back to A Rose Within the Thorns. I'm Mr. Rose, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Season 5, the Poetry Edition. If you've been following along this season, you'll know that we're deconstructing poetry, not to find one perfect interpretation, but to uncover the ideas, questions, and emotions that great poems leave us with. Remember, today's episode assumes that you've already read or listened to the poem. Make sure you have a copy nearby if you can, because I'll encourage you to pause, highlight, and make notes as we work through some of its key ideas. Today's poem is A Love Like Dorothy's by Alison Whittaker. This is one of those poems where context is absolutely essential. If you don't understand the conversation Whittaker is responding to, we risk missing much of what makes this poem so powerful. So, before we look at Whittaker's work, we need to travel back more than a century. So, Alison Whittaker is a Gomeroi poet, lawyer, and academic whose writing frequently explores identity, country, colonial history, justice, and the lived experiences of Aboriginal and First Nations Australians. Her poetry often asks readers to reconsider stories they've always accepted as true, rather than presenting history as fixed. She invites us to question whose voices have been celebrated, whose voices have been ignored, and what happens when those forgotten perspectives are finally heard. The poem we're discussing today appears in her acclaimed collection Blackwork, a collection that examines race, belonging, and Australia's colonial legacy with honesty, intelligence, and at times biting humour. To understand this poem, we need to understand what it's responding to. Many Australians grew up studying Dorothy McKellar's poem My Country. You've probably heard of it yourself, where it starts with I love a sunburnt country. It's one of the best known poems in Australian literature and celebrates Australia's dramatic landscape, famously expressing a deep affection for what McKellar describes as a rugged and beautiful land. For generations, that poem has helped shape ideas about Australian identity. But Whittaker asks an important question: whose Australia is being celebrated? And perhaps more importantly, whose stories are missing from that picture? That's what makes A Love Like Dorothy's such an interesting poem. It isn't simply criticizing another poet, it's entering into a conversation with Australian literature itself. So, as you listen today, I'd like you to keep returning to one question: can two people love the same place in completely different ways? At first, that might seem like an easy question. Of course they can. But Whittaker pushes us further. She asks whether our relationship with a place depends on our history, our culture, and our experiences. Is country simply somewhere we live, or is it something much deeper? That question sits at the heart of this poem. So let's begin with the title: A Love Like Dorothy's. Notice that Whittaker doesn't call the poem Dorothy's Love or My Country Revisited. Instead, she references another writer directly. Immediately, we're invited into a conversation between texts. This is what we call an intertextual poem. It gains meaning because it speaks to another work that many readers already know. Now, think about the tone. One of the most interesting things about this poem is that it refuses to settle into one emotion. At different moments, it can feel reflective, questioning, challenging, and deeply personal. That shifting tone mirrors the complexity of Australia's history. Whittaker isn't offering a simple answer. She's asking readers to sit with uncomfortable questions. Another feature worth noting is perspective. Unlike many poems that present one clear viewpoint, Whittaker reminds us that history always depends on who is telling the story. When we hear only one perspective for long enough, it can begin to feel like the only truth. Her poem interrupts that certainty. It invites another voice into the conversation. That's an incredibly powerful literary choice. Notice too how Whittaker uses familiar ideas about the Australian landscape, but encourages readers to see them differently. Land is never presented as simply scenery. Instead, country becomes connected to history, memory, culture, and identity. The shift is significant here. The landscape isn't just something to admire, it's something lived with, remembered, and carried across generations for First Nations Australians. As you reread the poem, ask yourself this question: where does Whittaker create tension? Often, the most important meaning isn't found in individual words, but in the space between two competing ideas: admiration and pain, belonging and exclusion, pride and grief. Those tensions are what gives the poem its emotional power. Let's collect some of the bigger ideas. So, first is country. Keep in mind when I'm saying country, I'm using the capital C. For many First Nations people, country is far more than geography. It includes relationships, history, culture, responsibility, and belonging. Understanding that broader meaning helps deepen our reader. The second concept is identity. Whittaker asks us to consider how identity is shaped by history and by our relationship with place. Another important idea is voice. Who gets to tell Australia's stories? Whose versions become famous? Whose perspectives have been overlooked? The poem also explores memory, not simply remembering the past, but recognizing that different communities remember the same events in different ways. Finally, there's belonging. Can love for a place exist alongside pain? Can pride exist alongside injustice? Whittaker suggests that these ideas aren't opposites. Sometimes they exist together. So here's today's tip. Whenever you study a poem that responds to another text, don't spend all your time looking for similarities. Instead, ask yourself, why has the newer poet chosen to challenge, reshape, or expand on the earlier work? Intertextuality isn't about copying, it's about joining a conversation. Whittaker is not replacing McKellar's poem. She's asking readers to consider another perspective that deserves to be heard. That's a much richer way to think about a relationship between two texts. Now it's time for my favorite part of every episode. Let's think about how this poem could inspire our own narrative by looking at from poem to page. Perhaps you're drawn to the idea of voice. You might write about a teenager discovering an old family journal that completely changes the story they've always believed about their hometown. Or maybe you're interested in belonging. Imagine someone returning to a place they haven't visited in years, only to realize that while the landscape looks familiar, their understanding of it has changed forever. Perhaps the concept of perspective stands out. Your narrative could tell the same event through two different characters, revealing how experience shapes truth. Or maybe your poem inspires you to think about country. Without copying Whittaker's ideas, you could explore the deep connection a character has to a place that outsiders may struggle to understand. Notice what we're doing here. We're not borrowing Whittaker's argument, we're borrowing the questions that she asks. That's often where the strongest narratives begin. Before we finish, I'd like you to think about one final question. How many stories can exist about the same place? The answer is probably more than we realize. Great literature reminds us that history isn't one voice speaking into silence. It's many voices speaking to one another across time. And sometimes understanding begins when we choose to listen to a voice we haven't heard before. So thank you for joining me for another episode of A Rose Within the Thorns. I hope today's discussion has encouraged you to think not only about this poem, but about the stories we inherit, the stories we question, and the stories we choose to tell. Next episode, we'll continue deconstructing another poem and exploring how its ideas can become the starting point for an original narrative. Until then, keep reading with curiosity, keep asking thoughtful questions, and remember, the best writers don't simply observe the world, they look at it from an angle no one else has considered. I'm Mr. Rose, and this has been A Rose Within the Thorns. Thank you for listening.